Hello.
If you can
Shall I
just share.
start?
No, I was going to give you a brief introduction.
Oh,
Well,
awesome.
not you, but the others, perhaps. Not that you need it, but still. If you just want to flash your slides in the meantime, that'll be great.
Sure.
So, as I say, T really doesn't need an introduction, but let me do my job here. So he used to be a food writer, and then his career took a terrible dive, and he became a philosophy professor at the University of Utah. Sorry, the dive is in philosophy professor, not Utah, obviously. He writes about trust, art, games, and communities, and generally he's interested in the ways that our social structures and technologies shape how we think and what we value. He's, of course, one of the leading voices in the epistemology of the internet, and hence inviting him here. But he's also widely published in little pathetic journals such as Mind, Philosophy and Phenomenological Research, and Philosophical Review, where he also happened to have received the prize last year for his article, Game and the Art of Agency. That also got classified as one of the 10 best philosophy articles of 2019. And then went on to become a book, I understand, I know, published by Oxford University Press. That's really awesome to read for any of you interested in anything actually, but games, value, agency, amazing stuff. So today he will speak to us about how Twitter gamifies communication. Welcome, T.
Hi, Riley. Thanks. Thanks, everyone. I'm sorry I couldn't be here for a lot of the conference. There's time zone stuff, and I'm traveling for the next 2 days, but this is the day I could be here for a tiny bit of time. Thanks for inviting me, and I'm thrilled that this is happening and that philosophy is moving in a direction that I was told that I couldn't do. Like, I was in graduate school, like, 12 years ago, like, no, you can't work on this. I was actually, I'm one of the reasons I'm thrilled here. I was talking to, oh my God, my name, I just blanked on her name, but the philosopher who's in charge of the Epistemic Bubbles Institute in Hamburg. And she said that 15 years ago, she was trying to write a dissertation on the ethics of big data. And she was told by everyone, nobody cares about this. Why would anyone work on this? No. And I think we managed to have, like, the degree of joyous, smug laughter she can have now is awesome. So also, because Valerie told me that there are a lot of people here that are working with the echo chambers material, I just wanted to say that there's now like 3 sequels out. So if you're interested in that, I can point your way to a few sequels that are out. One is a paper that's already out called The Seductions of Clarity, which is about how various forms of overclear simplified expression serve to cease our investigation into things. Another just came out in a response to, my brain is totally not working today. In a response to Robert Talise's Overdoing Democracy. So my paper is a response called, Was it Propaganda or Polarization? And the part that you all might be interested in is a part where I get mad at Sunstein and Talise for assuming that every like-minded enclave that increases its confidence must be irrational. And I say, no, think about safe spaces, think about consciousness raising groups. You have to be able to distinguish those two. And that actually turns out to be really hard. And the last is a paper that's about to come out that I'm happy to send anyone, called Playfulness versus Epistemic Traps, which asks whether a motive of intellectual playfulness, curiosity, or exploration for the sheer fun of it might be an antidote to certain kinds of structured dogmatic belief system. I'm happy to send that to anyone. All right, so talk about how Twitter gamifies communication. So I want to apologize to my fellow keynote speakers and maybe Veli. Some of this stuff you've heard before because I've been working on it for a while, but there's new material at the end. So especially I think Karen and Boaz have heard the middle of this paper, but if you just want to go away and get some coffee and come back for the last third, there's new material that no one's ever heard before. So what this comes out of is, obviously, I'm really interested in social epistemology, social media, and the technologies of communication and how they change the way we communicate. As Vela mentioned, the other part of my life is really doing philosophy of art and interested in the way how games work on us, right? What games do to us. And I think that aesthetics and social epistemology have a lot to say to each other, because I think aesthetics is actually a study, the philosophy of art and aesthetics is the study of how technology and technological mediums change how we express each other, express ourselves to each other, and condition our expression. So today is actually going to be a long attempt to run through multiple things. I'm actually going to try to give you like 3 different papers in one wild go, to all of which are examples, hopefully, of how thinking about aesthetics and art actually helps us understand social media, because they're studies of mediums and how we express ourselves in different mediums. Okay, so here's a background thought. So I'm a serious intellectual. I try to say serious intellectual things. And I went viral once on Twitter, wildly viral, for the dumbest tweet I've ever tweeted. It was like, my kid said something funny. I tweeted it. I went to teach class, and then I came back and it had 100,000 likes. And I was like, what the fuck is Twitter? And the interesting thing is, it like transforms, people will say this, when this happens, it transforms your motivations. I spent like a couple months trying to recreate this, to no avail, by the way. Everyone will tell you this, right? But it got in me. And I really wanted to understand how, I mean, I'm supposed to be a serious philosopher. I'm supposed to care about, but like, those points transformed what I was trying to do. And that's what I'm trying to understand. So here's the general theme. The Twitter gamifies communication by providing points for discourse, and that directs how we communicate in the platform insofar as we let ourselves be motivated by it. That is, Twitter isn't just a bare communication platform, it's preloaded with a temporary set of motivations. So the bigger background picture is that a lot of people think something like games are great, so gamification is great because it makes life more like a game. Jane McGonigal famously defended the view that gamification improves boredom, gets rid of boredom, and makes things more fun by making us more motivated to do things like exercise, communicate, and learn languages with like Duolingo. And I'm really worried about this. I think that gamifying things actually increases our motivation by simplifying and standardizing the target. And if you understand what makes real games great, you'll see why gamification is terrible. So here's what I mean. So to be clear, I'm going to say that Twitter is a bad game, but what I mean is it's really a fun game, but when you play it for fun, it's bad for the world, right? That's the general theme. So this comes in 3 acts. The first act, I'm going to quickly give you my general theory about games, why games are great. Second act, I'm going to show you why, if you understand why games are great, you'll understand why the gamification of Twitter is terrible. And the third act, totally new material that I think I've never spoken of before in public, a theory about how Twitter undermines intimacy and the game of Twitter undermines intimacy. Okay, why games are great. So what makes games an art form? So I got into this topic partially by getting irritated, which happens with me a lot. So I got really irritated because I was reading a bunch of philosophy of art about games, and they all talked about games as a kind of fiction or a kind of movie, and no one talked about the difficulty or the challenge or the skill, and I became wildly irritated. So I wanted to think about like what makes games special as an art form that emphasizes action, decision, and skill. And the basis here is this wonderful book from Bernard Suits, by the way, which is one of the most wonderful books I know, an underread book called The Grasshopper. By the way, this is a defense of play and idleness, and it's staged as a pseudo-Socratic dialogue between the grasshopper and his disciples. And it starts, if you haven't read this, it starts with the grasshopper on his deathbed surrounded by his disciples. And his disciples are all like, let us feed you. And the grasshopper says, no, no, for then I will turn you into worker ants. I would rather die for my dedication to idleness and play. Right. Anyway. So then in a series of dialogues, this theory comes out about what games are. Briefly, Suits defines games as taking up unnecessary obstacles voluntarily for the sake of the activity of struggling to overcome them. Right. For me, one way to put it is that in games, the obstacles are the point, right? The struggle is the point. And one of the ways you can tell is that in games, if you skip the constraints, it doesn't count as doing it. If you're running a marathon and you call an Uber, or you take an electric scooter, you have not, even if you get to the finish line, you've not done the thing, right? The constraint is integral to the activity. So one of the things that's really interesting to me that Suits reveals to me is that there are 2 modes of playing a game. I think there are 2 motivational states. One I want to call achievement play, and the other is striving play. Achievement players play because winning is important to them, and striving players temporarily get interested in winning for the sake of the enjoyable struggle. right? Another way the old saying, the journey is the destination, this is the technical version of that. So striving play involves what you call a motivational inversion. In ordinary life, you take the means for the sake of the ends, but see if you like this way of putting it. With striving play, you pick the end for the sake of the means. Does that make sense? I'm a rock climber and I try to get to the top of the cliff, not to be at the top of the cliff. You could get there any old way, but because of the kind of struggle that goal and those constraints shape. So let me emphasize this again. A game specifies a goal and it specifies constraints, which thereby constitute obstacles. The goals and the constraints together create obstacles. You can't have obstacles without a goal. And we do it because struggling against those obstacles is fun. Background thought. Actually, no, I have a slide for this that's coming up in a bit. Okay. Actually, background thought. So what games reveal to us and striving play reveals to us is we have a capacity that's wonderful and creepy. And that capacity is someone gives you some point and you can be like, I care about that now, right? That we are beings that can respond explicit points. So a lot of people worry that striving play isn't real. And here are two arguments that striving play is real. One is sometimes we limit our ability to win in the long term, even when we try all out to win in the short term. So my spouse and I play board games all the time. Mostly, so she's a chemist and she's much better at me at kind of geometrical manipulation. So any game that's like Tetris, she beats me. Any game, let me be honest, that involves deceit and social manipulation, I can win. I don't like to think about it too much. But sometimes we find a game where we're perfectly balanced and the games are beautiful. And then at night, I will find a strategy guide. And I know, first of all, that my spouse will never read strategy guides. And second, that if I read it, I'm just going to win. And if I do it, the games will turn boring. Does this argument make sense? If I'm an achievement player, I should just read the strategy guide and win. But I'm not. I don't read the strategy guide because that would make it boring. And if that's rational, then striving play is real. Here's another argument. Consider stupid games. A stupid game, sorry, this is a technical term I came up with, stupid games. So, okay. Stupid games are games that are only fun if you try to win, but the fun part is failing, like Twister, or drinking games, or the children's game of telephone, right? So the funny part is falling, but it's not fun if you intend to fall. You actually have to try to win and then fail because we're trying to succeed. We're trying to fail. Does that make sense? But in order to fail, you can't try to do it. So what you have to do during the game is to aim at success, even though your larger purpose is failure. So stupid games demonstrate the possibility of striving play, which demonstrates our capacity to take on disposable ends, which are ends specified by an outside source, typically in the form of points. So this helps us answer a question about what games are. What's the artistic medium of games? You might say it's rules, but there's a lot of games that involve things that aren't rules. They involve physical material. This is an interaction with the world. This is one of my favorite games. This is called Pew 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 Pew. That's the actual name. It's an indie game. And when you play, there are only two controls. One fires the laser and the other fires the jetpack, right? That's it. They're binary controls. First wrinkle. So you're just trying, it's a side scroller. You're just trying to get through it. First wrinkle. Two players play cooperatively. One controls the laser, the other controls the jetpack, right? Second wrinkle, you don't have a controller, you have microphones, and the person that controls the jetpack does it by going, and the person that controls the laser has to go pew, 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 pew. And much of the difficulty of the game involves the room's ambiance, how dry your mouth is, and how hard it is to physically make the noise when you're laughing, because the room starts to laugh and you start to laugh too. So it's not just the rules, right? It's the physicality. Is it the obstacles? But I think the deepest thought from Rainer Knizia, who's a genius of board game design, he says that the scoring system sets the player's motivations in the game. I just want to pause on this because this is the most important thing going forward for thinking about Twitter. The designer of a game puts down points and that specifies what your goals are in the game, and you have the capacity to make yourself care about it because it's specified in the game, right? Hopefully you can see where we're going. So, big view, playing games involves taking on temporary disposable ends and submerging ourselves in them as if they are final, and game designers tell us what those ends are. And we have the ability to just be like, hey, and just think about how much this is like our actual experience of game playing. So if you play geeky games like this, like Agricola, this is my life. you open up the board game, you don't even know what you want. You don't know if you're cooperating or fighting with each other. You don't know if you're playing on your own or in teams. You don't know what you're trying to do. And the game rules just tell you, and you're like, okay, I'm breeding sheep. Awesome, right? The game just tells you what to care about. So the game designer designates the values and goals of the in-game agency, the abilities of the in-game agent, and the environment that the in-game agent operates within. If you want a slogan, one is that the game designer designs a practical agent and their practical environment. If you want a little more TED Talky, it's the game designer works in the medium of agency. If you want maximum TED Talky, it's the games are the art of agency. So striving play demonstrates our ability for agential fluidity. Someone can just write down a goal and we have the capacity to just make ourselves care about it for a time. And I think this is fine. Let's see where this is going. If we step back from it at the end of the game, if it's a temporary submersion. What they highlight is that we can exercise our agential fluidity easily when there are clearly explained systems of rules and scores that we can submerge ourselves in. Hopefully it's clear that what I'm going to say is Twitter is not something you step back from. And it's not something that you put away and close and push those points out of your system. It's something that is pervasive. So why play games? One of the many reasons I think that's really important is that games offer us an experience of value clarity. So experience of life in the world is one of, I think, profound value nausea. Like there's millions of things to care about. They're hard to compare to each other. Like I'm supposed to be a good parent and a good researcher and keep myself healthy and happy. And how do I measure those against each other? Like, when do I sacrifice one in terms of the other? And it's hard to tell how well you're doing, right? Like, I'm supposed to be raising a good kid. This happens all the time. Yesterday, instead of like going to bed, he was running around screaming, telling stories and shouting down the stairs at me. Am I raising a creative, free-spirited child, or am I raising an undisciplined monster, right? Figuring it out is hard, but in games, you know exactly what you're doing, you know exactly how well you've done, and you know exactly how it's measured, because games involve explicit measurements of success in mechanically executable terms. They're kind of an existential balm. Okay, so by the way, one distinctive danger of games, I should just say, there's a lot of evidence that people don't actually become more violent in playing games. What I'm worried about is that they might export the expectation of value clarity outside the game and be drawn to systems and institutions, professions that offer them some semblance of value clarity. Or in other words, I'm not worried about making games making serial killers. I'm worried about them making Wall Street bankers, right? Okay, so last thing on games. Then we'll get to what actually matters for this conference. So what's the point of all these rules? Isn't it authoritarian? Miguel Sicart, game theorist, says games are a bad form of play. The play is essentially free and games try to structure it, destroying the essence of play. What I want to respond is that every medium of communication involves some rules to stabilize communication, right? And various technological mediums use these rules to record bits of human experience. Fiction and movies let us record stories, painting and photography let us record images, and games let us record forms of agency and try them out. And I think that games can support freedom and autonomy because they offer us ways to communicate in modes of agency. They're a library of agencies. You can try on different agencies by playing chess, playing diplomacy, playing soccer. And they can help us become more free when you transition between lots and lots of different games and try on different agential styles. Hopefully you can see what's coming, which is it's not freeing if you're stuck in one, right? One worry is how could following rules ever make us more free? Here's a suggestion. Think about yoga, right? What yoga does is it breaks us out of our habits and learns new postures by giving us strict directions about how to move. So last slogan, games are yoga for your agency. What I'm going to suggest now is Twitter is not like doing real yoga, but being stuck in triangle pose for your entire life. Okay, all of that is from that. All right, gamification of Twitter is bad. Games are great, the gamification of Twitter is bad. This is from a paper called How Twitter Gamifies Communication, which I should also say, sometimes I have regrets about this. This paper is a lot of the detail and the complexities in the book. This paper simplifies a lot of details. I wrote it intending it to be teachable for undergraduates, so maybe it's useful for you, but there's a lot of details that are hidden. And sometimes I feel bad about that, but okay. But the details are in other papers. Okay. So gamification is a process that explicitly builds game-like features like points and levels as scoring systems into ordinary activities. Fitbit, Strava, Twitter, Facebook, Disney's gamified workforce. Jane McGonigal, famously, gamification advocate, hero of Silicon Valley, says that gamification increases motivation by making activities more fun. But I think what we've seen so far is the pleasure of games comes from their simplified value systems, and they're, in particular, they create modes of value that are mechanically measurable, which create value clarity. So to introduce those pleasures into ordinary activities, you have to transform ordinary activities by simplifying and narrowing the goals of those activities. So gamification increases motivation in exchange for simplifying the target. So my claim here isn't, by the way, that if you put Twitter on your phone, you're fucked. I'm not saying that like it's automatic, but I'm saying that in order for you to have the thrill of Twitter, like in order to have the pleasure that's on offer of, oh my God, I'm getting so many likes, you have to admit into yourself, align your motivations with the scoring system. And that scoring system is simplified, which is what I'm going to argue next. So actual games work well because their simplified targets are for secluded activities. You step into the game, you step back from them. The ends of a real game are disposable and you can explore different games. Gamification is for non-secluded activities and it's pervasive, right? So what I pursue on the game board doesn't necessarily have much impact outside of the game. If my motivation for communication changes on Twitter, then I think all of you know what happens, right? And it's pervasive. You don't get to step back from it. Twitter, in my experience at least, threatens to engulf you at all times. There's no endpoint. So here's the basic idea. A lot of us come to Twitter with an interest in a rich plurality of often hard to measure values: communication, connection, collaboration. And Twitter's scoring system aims us instead of virality, likes and retweets and follower counts. So virality is easy to measure mechanically, but a far thinner value. So virality is not the same as communication. Here's one way to put the problem. Games are appealing because the values are artificially clear. To gamify ordinary life, you need to bring that clarity to ordinary activities. And to do that, you need to change and simplify the target. Okay, we're in response. I think this is the standard response. Are Twitter likes a decent proxy for good communication? If someone clicks like, doesn't that mean they approved, and isn't that good for communication? What I want to say is, in general, they're a vague proxy, but the gap between what the proxy of the Twitter like measures and our actual values for communication is vast. And that's where a lot of the problem comes from. Here's the first reason. Twitter captures positive first impressions and not long-term impressions. So this is just a simple fact about Twitter. You typically hit like on things the moment you see them, right? If you really like a tweet, if you don't like a tweet at first, and then it simmers in you for a week or a month, and then you're like, oh, that was really interesting, you're very unlikely to hit like, just from the ease of use in the interface, right? I once actually tried. I was like, oh, I really like that tweet. I was been thinking about it. And I was like, I should go like it. And I spent like 5 minutes trying to find it. I was like, fuck it, it's too much trouble. And we don't do that typically. So does that make sense? So the particular form of information capture hyper-emphasizes first impressions and not long-term impressions. And as philosophers know, a lot of the good stuff takes a while to process. Second reason, Twitter emphasizes the total number of likes, rather aggregates the totality rather than any particular profound communicative connection. This is an argument I stole from my friend Matt Stroll, who's a philosopher of art. So he has this great piece called Against Rotten Tomatoes, where he argues that Rotten Tomatoes is undermining art. This is the argument. So he says, look, great art is often very divisive. You should want to go to see, okay, here's a recent example. Half the reviews of Dune are like, this is amazing, this is overwhelming. And the other half are like, this is boring as shit. And Maxwell says, that's a sign you should go watch it. Like that kind of divisiveness, right? And with some people saying like, oh my God, I love, right? That's important. But all Rotten Tomatoes does is it measures how many critics are on the positive side and negative side and aggregates them. So Dune if half the people love it and half the people hate it, shows up as 50%, which is mediocre. Something like Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, Part 2, I think if what you had was almost every critic being like, oh, it's pretty good, right? But that registers as vaguely positive, and because of the way that because of the information that Rotten Tomatoes strips out, and then because of what it aggregates, that shows up, that gets highlighted, right? Does that make sense? So you lose all kinds of information. So for example, when I'm talking to a class of 100 kids, sometimes I say something and I'm like, if one kid is profoundly moved by this, that's enough for me. And I can see it in their face. But Twitter eliminates that, right? It makes salient the total aggregate. Last reason, it diminishes the plurality for which we communicate, right? And I think this is in some ways the most important. If a large percentage of Twitter is increasingly come to be motivated by the points, and the points measure the same thing, then our reasons for communication will drift towards a single monolith. And I mean, we have a lot of reasons from political philosophy to think that reducing the values reducing the plurality of values for which we communicate is actually terrible. There's some really interesting study. So this is not, so in a different paper that I'm working on right now, I'm really interested in this book that I think a lot of people should read called Engines of Anxiety. It's a sociological study of the coming of the US News and World Report law school rankings to the legal education system. And they provide a lot of empirical evidence that once you get a singular ranking system, value plurality gets driven out of the system. People stop pursuing different goals and just start pursuing the rankings. We see this seems to happen. Anyway, you should read that book. So much of the problem comes that in order to work as a gamification, it needs to offer you points for something that's quickly and easily captured by a mass scale technology. It's just hard right now to measure connection, empathy, and understanding, and it's easy to measure short-term popularity. So the need to create a quick system of gamification tends to push the values towards things that can be easily and cheaply measured. By the way, you could have the enormous social goods of Twitter, communication and connection, without the gamification. You would just have to hide the scores, but then you'd lose the pleasure of artificial value clarity. Okay. I'm doing okay on that. Okay, last part. This is, by the way, this is totally new. I think this is the first time I've ever talked this through. This is actually a public philosophy piece I wrote for a new philosophy magazine called The Raven that hasn't come out yet. And I've been really excited to talk about this with people, but I haven't yet. And I didn't write it, and it wasn't originally written as part of the gamification project, but now I'm starting to see more connection. So I just want to give this to you. This is a first attempt at explaining this. So I want to claim that Twitter invites intimate and insider talk, and then does something really painful to it. And the best way to understand this, strangely, or not strangely, is with this wonderful book from Ted Cohen called Jokes. Ted Cohen's a philosopher of art. He wrote some very nice, very abstract philosophy of art. By the way, this is, again, part of my drive to convince people in social epistemology to read more aesthetics, because it's about the same stuff. So my favorite book of his is this book called Jokes, which is a theory of jokes. Not all humor, but just jokes, like one-liners and things with punchlines. And his theory is that jokes depend on shared background knowledge and the surprise revelation of shared background knowledge. So here's the argument. Here's the evidence. You ruin a joke if you share the background knowledge that you need ahead of time to warn people, right? So if I'm about to tell a racist Asian joke, and I start by saying, okay, before I tell the joke, what you all need to know is there's a stereotype in America that Asians are bad drivers. Okay, now I'm going to tell the joke, right? That will ruin the joke, right? The shared background knowledge needs to emerge as a surprise. So here's Cohen's theory. Valerie, I just saw your face like this light up. This is such a beautiful theory. He says the joke teller has to presume the existence of background knowledge, right? You can't secure it, you have to presume it. So every joke telling is a risk, right? And he thinks it's an act of vulnerability because you presume a shared piece of knowledge you can't secure. And if the other people don't share the background knowledge or don't have the sense of humor together, your joke is going to fail and you're going to look stupid. So this is the theory. Every joke depends on and emphasizes intimacy because it depends on an act which presumes a shared context without verification, right? So here's one way I think about this idea to myself. Jokes are kind of intimacy pumps, right? So every joke depends on a conscious risk and a gamble of some connection. But when the joke comes off, if you're in the audience, what you've seen is someone take a risk, a gamble, a social risk of some kind of minor or major social humiliation that depends on your having some shared background context. So when it comes off, right, it emphasizes the connection between you because they've taken a risk on there already being such a connection. So it depends on, and then it strengthens intimacy. One way you could put it is that every joke is a kind of trust fall. That makes sense? You just fling yourself on the void and hope that the other person has the shared background information. Cohen says this. He says, when we laugh together, this is a very special occasion. It is already noteworthy that we laugh at all, at anything, that we laugh all alone. That we do it together is the satisfaction of a deep human longing, the realization of a desperate hope. It is the hope that we are enough like one another to sense one another, to be able to live together. And this is why he says jokes are good for community building and why they're good for exclusion, right? Every joke emphasizes an in-group connection. So you can use it to build connections, but you also use it to exclude. And this is why he thinks jokes, so Ted Cohen is Jewish. The book, by the way, is just this compendium of amazing Jewish humor. And he says, like, this is why jokes are so often used to build in-group community, but why so many are racist and sexist. Because intimacy is deeply connected with alienation, right? To build an in-group, you also have to push out and exclude. Okay, claim. Twitter short form, it doesn't require, but it encourages jokes. That is, it encourages short statements that are filled out by shared background knowledge. A lot of the short statements involve an understanding of the viewer's actual position to see the irony, right? Like for example, on Twitter, I'll occasionally on a friend's thread be like, say something like, well, everyone knows that public philosophy is bullshit. We should only be talking about metaphysics. And this is funny if you know me, right? And you know that I care about things like Twitter, right? If you didn't know me, you might interpret me literally, which would be terrible. So it's funny in this joke. Why is that joke funny? It's funny precisely because it depends on prior knowledge about what me and what I care about, right? The irony depends and emphasizes the fact that we share some knowledge about what our shared beliefs are. And I feel like sometimes Twitter is a game that involves how much you can apply with how few words, how many references you can connect together, how much shared background knowledge you can gesture at with just a few words. Okay, here's the next slide, but I need to set it up a little because you need to know when it came. So January 6, 2020, the Capitol insurrection in the United States. Everyone's terrified. There are people attacking the Capitol. We're all watching TV. We're all I was doom scrolling Twitter. And then I got to the following slide from Sarah Joan. I'm at the coup. I'm at the super spreader event. I'm at the combination coup super spreader event. Okay. No one here laughs. I laughed like hell. So there's a number of things going on. One is that most of us, I think, at the time had been so into holy shit, there's a coup at the Capitol that we've forgotten about COVID. And so that introduces one connection. But the really important thing is the background connection to the Das Racist novelty hip song, I'm at the Pizza Hut, I'm at the Taco Bell, I'm at the combination Pizza Hut and Taco Bell, which is an absurdist song. And if you have this in your head, right, and you see this tweet, that surprise connection is what's funny. And then you're like, ha ha ha, wait, am I the only one? And you look down and you're like, oh shit, 70,000 other people like this. I am not alone in this weird moment of absurdity in which I experience, I think what part of what makes this funny is that this song is, so Das Racist is this hyper intellectual, I think they're all PhD students in comp lit. It's this hyper intellectual group. And they made this stupid novelty song. And part of the joke is knowing how hyper intellectual they are. And they made this dumb song. And then that absurdity somehow connects with it. Anyway, but again, it requires an enormous amount of shared background knowledge. So the experience of Twitter feels like this to me. You hurl a possible intimacy into the void, and Twitter can't give you the connection of feeling of in-person laughter, but it rewards you with likes and retweets. It quantifies intimacy, and it looks like this, right? It's me thinking, wow, 66.9 thousand people also are like me in this really bizarre way. So a friend of mine explained the joy of fishing like this. You throw a line into the void, you see nothing, and sometimes the line comes to life. And this is what I think Twitter feels like to me. It's like fishing for connection, right? You throw out that joke, and sometimes people react. Okay, and then Twitter punishes it by taking tweets out of context. Remember, jokes work depending on shared context. Sarah Jeong, by the way, who wrote this tweet, was newly fired from the New York Times for tweeting #CancelWhitePeople, even though everyone that knew her, it was clear to her that she wasn't racist. Like, that was a joke that depended on knowing her complex views, but she got fired for being racist, right? Because the tweet was taken out of context. So Twitter provides a mechanism for punishing intimacy, which is a familiar thing from new media studies, which is context collapse, right? If you take something that depends on rich shared context and you tweet it out to people that don't have context, then it makes it really easy to misinterpret jokes and read them uncharitably. So Twitter now looks to me like an engine for creating context collapse. So it's no accident this happens a lot. So first, it incentivizes risky, intimate context-dependent speech, and then it gives you a mechanism for ripping that speech out of context, the retweet, which is right there. And then it incentivizes moral outrage, which gives people an incentive for finding context collapse. So Twitter is a game whose structures and affordances first incentivize intimate, high context expressions, and then incentivize jerking those expressions out of context. Or Twitter is a game that calls for intimacy and then crushes it. Thanks.